The Thin Blue Secret by Gideon Chase. Chapter 1. The Ghosts of the Past. Detective Evan Hayes stood at the edge of the rain-soaked street, staring into the murky reflection of his own face and the cracked windshield of his old sedan. The headlights of passing cars cut through the night, their beams briefly illuminating the city's grim reality. Dark alleys, neon signs flickering in the rain, and the pulse of an underworld that never slept. A cold wind blew in from the river, carrying with it the familiar scent of wet pavement and regret. It had been 3 years since they'd kicked him off the force. 3 years since that one decision, that one mistake, had cost him everything. The badge, the gun, the respect, all gone. Now, all he had left was the hollow weight of a past he couldn't escape and a future that didn't seem worth facing. But there was something that still gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite shake off. The case that brought him down, the one that had turned his life upside down, had never fully made sense. It was supposed to be a straightforward internal investigation, a crooked cop on the payroll of a drug cartel. But when Hayes had dug deeper, when he had pushed too hard, things went wrong. The investigation had been shut down, the evidence erased, and the men behind it all had been allowed to walk free. That was the moment everything changed. That was when they decided he had to go. But now, years later, the itch returned. A phone call had shaken him from his self-imposed exile. "We need you, Hayes. A murder. You're the only one who can get to the bottom of it." The voice on the other end had been familiar, gruff, authoritative, and distant. It was Captain Reed. Hayes had always respected the old man, but Reed had been part of the system that took him down. And yet, there he was, reaching out in a way that suggested desperation. Hayes didn't know what it was about this case that intrigued him so much. Maybe it was the way Reed had made it sound so personal, the way he spoke about the victim, a rookie cop named Alex Carter, found dead in a back alley with no witnesses and a trail that led to nowhere. Or maybe it was just the realization that this was his chance to prove, once and for all, that he wasn't the man they had painted him to be. As Hayes surveyed the street once more, his mind wandered back to the dark days of his downfall, the whispers in the precinct, the way his fellow officers had turned their backs on him, the nights he spent in that grimy apartment, drowning in cheap whiskey and the weight of betrayal. But the worst part, the part that had haunted him since that day, was the nagging feeling that someone in the department had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, someone who knew exactly how to make him fall. Now, as the rain splattered against his coat, he felt the pull again, the need to uncover the truth, to bring justice to the shadows that had consumed him. But that truth was buried deep within the precinct, behind locked doors and behind the faces of people he once called brothers. The thought of returning to that world made his stomach twist, but he had no choice. This was his chance to finally get the answers he needed. He couldn't walk away now. A flash of movement caught his eye. A figure, draped in shadows, stepped from the alley across the street. Hayes squinted through the rain, his heart racing as the figure drew closer. The hooded man approached slowly, his face obscured by the darkness. As he got nearer, Hayes could see the glint of something shiny, a badge, barely visible under the folds of his rain-soaked jacket. "Hayes," the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "They're watching." It took a moment for Hayes to recognize the voice. Detective Carla Mitchell, a name from his past. She had been one of the few who had never abandoned him, but she had her own reasons for staying away, her own demons to fight. Hayes didn't know whether to trust her anymore. "What do you mean?" Hayes asked, his voice gruff. He didn't have time for cryptic messages or vague warnings. Not now. "The murder," she continued, her eyes darting nervously around. It's not what it seems. Carter, he wasn't just some rookie cop caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's more to this. A lot more. And it's tied to something inside the department. Hayes' chest tightened. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. You're saying the department's involved? Mitchell nodded, the gravity of her words settling in. I can't say more, but I have a lead. A name, actually. Someone close to the case who's been covering their tracks. They're connected to something bigger, something dangerous. If you're serious about finding the truth, you need to follow the money. The money? Hayes echoed, his mind racing. Who's paying off who? She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting someone to be watching. You'll know soon enough. But you have to be careful, Hayes. This isn't just a simple murder investigation. It's a game of power, of people with too much to lose. And you're already too deep into it. With that, she turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the rain and the shadows. Hayes stood motionless, his mind spinning. He didn't know who he could trust, but one thing was clear. The past was clawing its way back to him, and this case was no accident. The people behind it, the ones pulling the strings, had their sights set on him. They knew he was the loose thread, and they were willing to do whatever it took to silence him. The faint sound of sirens in the distance broke his thoughts. It was time to go to work. With one last glance at the rain-drenched city, Hayes climbed into his car and slammed the door shut. He wasn't about to run anymore. The ghosts of his past might haunt him, but it was time to drag them into the light. Chapter 2, A Trail of Secrets. Evan Hayes stared at the flashing neon sign in front of him, its faint glow cutting through the haze of cigarette smoke and humidity that clung to the cramped room. The Blue Velvet, a dive bar on the wrong side of town, had been his haven in the years after his fall from grace. The patrons didn't ask questions, and he didn't have to explain himself. They were all looking for the same thing, forgetting. But tonight, he wasn't here to forget. The door swung open behind him, and a gust of wind brought the scent of rain-soaked streets into the room. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Her footsteps were too familiar, the kind that didn't belong in a place like this. Detective Carla Mitchell. She had always had a way of cutting through the grime of the world and still coming out clean. At least she used to. You've been here before, she said quietly, sliding into the seat across from him, her eyes scanning the room, ever watchful. Hayes didn't say anything at first. Instead, he took a long drag from the cigarette dangling from his lips and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke swirl in the dim light. It was a habit he had picked up in his darker days, something to ease the edge when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. But there was no escaping it now, not after tonight. You were right about Carter, he said, his voice low, rough around the edges. I've been digging into it. Something's off. Mitchell's eyes flicked toward the door before she leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper. It's bigger than Carter. I'm telling you, Hayes, there's a whole network behind this. And I don't just mean the drug cartels. You think the department is clean? You're wrong. There are people at the top who don't want this getting out. Hayes frowned, his mind racing. He had always known the department had its skeletons. Corruption wasn't a surprise. But something about this felt different. Carter's death had been too clean, too controlled. And now Mitchell was telling him that it was all tied to something far more sinister than a rookie cop who had gotten in over his head. Who's pulling the strings? He asked, leaning forward. Mitchell hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. I can't say yet, but I've got a name. A detective who's been acting weird, laying low since the murder. I don't think it's a coincidence. His name's Jimmy Collins. Hayes' heart skipped a beat. Jimmy Collins. He was a name from the old days, a cop who had always walked a fine line between right and wrong. A man who knew how to cover his tracks, to play the game without anyone noticing. Collins had been part of the same unit as Hayes, but he had always been the kind of guy who stayed in the background, kept his distance. "Where is he now?" Hayes asked. Mitchell glanced around again, as if expecting someone to be listening. "That's the thing. I don't know. He's gone underground, but I've got a contact who might be able to help. I need you to meet him tonight." "Who?" "You don't need to know his name," she said, standing up quickly. "Just be there. The address is on this card. Don't ask questions, and don't trust anyone else. Collins is just the tip of the iceberg." Hayes pocketed the card and stood as well, his instincts kicking in. Something was happening, something big. He could feel it in his gut. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became, but there was no turning back now. Too many people were involved, and too many lives were at stake. And, somehow, his own was already wrapped up in the mess. As Mitchell made her way toward the door, she paused and turned back. "Be careful, Hayes. Whoever is behind this isn't playing by the rules, and you're already marked." Hayes didn't respond. He knew she was right. He had always been a man who played by the rules, even when it cost him. But now those rules didn't matter anymore. In this world, only one thing mattered: getting to the truth before it consumed him whole. The rain had picked up as Hayes made his way to the address Mitchell had given him. The streets were quieter now, the usual hum of the city muted by the storm. He drove through the winding alleyways, his headlights cutting through the night as the urban landscape blurred around him. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. This wasn't just another shady part of town. This was where the real darkness lived. The building he pulled up to was an old warehouse, its exterior weathered by years of neglect. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the broken windows. Hayes parked his car and approached the front door, his hand instinctively brushing the gun at his side. He wasn't expecting trouble, but in a place like this, you always had to be prepared. He knocked 3 times, each strike echoing in the silence. The door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin figure cloaked in shadow. Hayes couldn't make out his face at first, but the man's posture suggested a certain awareness, like he was always watching, always waiting. "Detective Hayes," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I was expecting you." Hayes stepped inside without saying a word, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The warehouse was empty, save for a few crates stacked in the corner and the distant hum of old machinery. The air smelled of dust and something far less pleasant, like mildew, like death. "You're the contact Mitchell mentioned," Hayes said, his tone sharp, trying to get a read on the man. The stranger nodded slowly. "Mitchell's right to be cautious. You're in deeper than you think, and you're going to need all the help you can get." Hayes didn't like the sound of that, but he wasn't about to back down. "What do you know about Jimmy Collins?" The man stepped forward, his face still hidden in shadow. "More than you think. And I can tell you this, Hayes, there's a reason you were brought into this. You've got a connection to the truth, a connection they don't want you to uncover." He handed Hayes a folder, its edges worn and stained. "Everything you need to know is in here. But be careful. They've got eyes everywhere." Hayes took the folder, his fingers brushing against the man's as he did. The chill of the room seemed to settle deep in his bones. He had no idea what he was getting into, but there was no turning back now. Not with a case this big, and not with the truth slipping further away with each passing hour. Chapter 3: Shadows in the Dark. The folder weighed heavily in Evan Hayes' hands as he made his way back to his car. The rain hadn't let up, its steady rhythm tapping against the roof of the vehicle like a reminder of the storm that was closing in around him. He could feel the pressure building, the kind of pressure that had driven him out of the force, the kind that made a man doubt his every move. But he couldn't back out now. He couldn't walk away. Not when the pieces were starting to fall into place, and not when Carter's murder felt more like the tip of an iceberg than an isolated incident. The folder on the passenger seat seemed to pulse with a dark promise, the edges torn and worn like it had been handled by too many people, each of them trying to keep it hidden. Hayes' fingers hovered over it for a moment before he opened it, revealing a stack of grainy photographs, police reports, and handwritten notes. His eyes quickly scanned the contents, taking in the names, dates, and places, each one more disturbing than the last. There was something about the way the information was laid out that made him uneasy. It was as if someone had been keeping track of everything for years, documenting every move, every decision, every corrupt deal. And as he flipped through the pages, one name jumped out at him: Detective James Jimmy Collins. Collins was in the photographs, caught in unflattering positions. Meetings with shady figures, shady deals, and worse, whispers of involvement in multiple cover-ups. Hayes knew that Collins had always been a loose cannon, a cop who played fast and loose with the law, but he never suspected anything like this. He was deep in it, deep in a web of corruption that stretched far beyond what Hayes could have imagined. As Hayes reached the last page, a detailed map of the city caught his eye. Several locations were marked with X's, some familiar, some not. His heart sank when he noticed one of the locations, the Blue Velvet. He slammed the folder shut, his mind racing. Collins had been at the bar just days before Carter's murder. But why? Was this all connected? Was it possible that Carter had been tangled up in something far more dangerous than a simple botched robbery? The questions kept coming, relentless, gnawing at him as he started the engine. He had to see it for himself. He had to understand what was really going on beneath the surface. The Blue Velvet was emptier than usual when Hayes walked through the door. The bar's usual crowd was nowhere to be found, and the bartender, an older man with a permanent scowl, only glanced up briefly before continuing to wipe down the counter. Hayes approached the bar, keeping his eyes sharp, scanning the room for anything out of place. His presence wasn't exactly welcome, but it didn't matter. He wasn't here to make friends. "What can I get you?" the bartender asked, his voice thick with disinterest. Hayes ignored the question and slid the folder across the counter. "I need information about Collins." The bartender hesitated, his hand tightening around the cloth. Then, with a quick glance around, he leaned in closer. "You're asking about someone who's untouchable around here, Hayes. The Blue Velvet's not exactly a place for clean business." "Tell me what you know," Hayes pressed, his voice low but firm. "I don't care about your rules." The bartender's eyes flicked nervously to the back of the room, where the dim light of the jukebox cast eerie shadows on the walls. "You want to know what you're getting into? Fine." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "But you're not going to like it." Hayes narrowed his eyes, waiting. "Collins, he didn't just deal with the usual lowlifes," the bartender continued, his words slurring slightly from years of habit. "He was mixed up in things much bigger than drugs or gambling. Human trafficking, arms deals, you name it. And if you think he's the only one, think again." The words hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He had suspected something deeper, but to hear it so bluntly confirmed was a shock. The case had grown into something monstrous, a far cry from the murder of a young cop. This was a whole system, a machine that had been feeding on the city's darkest secrets for far too long. "Where is he?" Hayes asked, leaning in, his voice hard. "I don't know, but I've seen him meeting with people in the old warehouse down by the docks. They talk in code, like they're waiting for something. But I don't know what. That's all I know, Hayes. I swear." Hayes grabbed the folder from the counter and pushed the cash for his drink across the bar. He didn't thank the bartender. There was no need. He knew exactly what he had to do next. The docks were a ghost town by the time Hayes arrived. The usual hum of the port was replaced by the sound of waves crashing against the hulls of empty ships. The wind whipped through the air, carrying with it the scent of salt and oil. He parked his car in the shadows, the engine's quiet hum barely audible over the noise of the storm. His eyes scanned the old warehouse in the distance. It was as desolate as it had been when he'd seen it earlier, but now it felt like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. As Hayes approached, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. He could feel it in the air, thick with tension. Every step he took seemed to echo louder, like someone or something was watching him. He took cover behind a stack of old crates, peering out cautiously. His eyes landed on the faint silhouettes of figures gathered around the warehouse's entrance. Their conversations were too muffled to make out, but the weight of their presence was undeniable. Then he saw him. Jimmy Collins, standing at the center of the group, his face half hidden in shadow, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was the man who had orchestrated Carter's downfall. Hayes could feel it in his gut. And now he was here, hidden behind layers of secrecy and lies. But Hayes was done waiting. He wasn't going to let this slip away again. Chapter 4: The Devil's Bargain. The cold, salty air stung against Hayes' face as he crouched behind the crates, watching the shadows shift in the dim light. The warehouse stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the docks, its windows dark and sealed, with only the faintest hint of activity inside. The figures gathered near the entrance moved with purpose, their voices a murmur beneath the storm's roar. Hayes shifted his position, trying to get a better look at the group. Collins was still at the center, talking to someone. A man, tall and imposing, stood beside him. The man's face was hidden by the brim of a wide hat, but his build was enough to make Hayes tense. He was a heavy hitter, no doubt, someone who didn't get involved unless there was something worth protecting. The conversation was low, too low for Hayes to make out any details, but the body language told him everything he needed to know. Collins was relaxed, but the other man was stiff, his eyes scanning the surroundings like he expected trouble. Hayes could only guess what kind of deal was unfolding. All he knew for sure was that it wasn't good. Collins leaned in closer to the other man, and Hayes watched as he handed over something, a small, wrapped bundle. Hayes couldn't tell what it was, but the exchange was deliberate, too deliberate. He felt a chill in his bones. This was it. This was what Carter had been trying to expose. Something bigger than a cop's murder, a network of power, corruption, and darkness running right through the heart of the department. Hayes had seen deals like this before, the kind that operated in the shadows, where law and morality held no sway. But he'd never been this close to one, never this tangled up in the mess. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with what to do next. He needed to get closer, needed to hear more, but the risk was immense. If anyone spotted him, he would be just another name on the list. He was about to retreat into the shadows when something caught his attention. A familiar face. Detective Angela Vasquez. She stepped out from behind a stack of crates, her dark hair damp with rain, her expression cold as she locked eyes with Hayes. She didn't flinch, didn't show any surprise at his presence, just a knowing look that made Hayes' heart skip a beat. Vasquez had always been a wild card, a cop who played it straight when it suited her, but didn't hesitate to cross lines when the situation demanded it. She'd been with the department longer than most, and her reputation was built on getting things done, no matter the cost. "What the hell are you doing here, Hayes?" Vasquez asked, her voice a low hiss. "I should be asking you the same thing," he shot back, his eyes narrowing. "I thought you were on the up and up. What are you doing with Collins and his boys?" Vasquez glanced back at the group, her lips curling into a slight smirk. You really think I'm just going to stand on the sidelines while all this goes down? I have my own interest in this game, Hayes. Your interests? Hayes couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're working with them? No, not exactly. She glanced over her shoulder again, making sure no one was watching. But I've been trying to get to the bottom of this mess long before you decided to stick your nose in it. Carter's murder wasn't random. It was a message. A message? Hayes' stomach tightened. A message from who? She hesitated, glancing back at the men in the shadows. I don't know, but I have an idea. I've been tracking Collins for months now, watching him move through the system like he owns it. He's not just some rogue cop. He's part of something bigger, something that's tied into every level of this city's power. You're saying he's running this whole thing? Not alone. He's part of a network. High-ranking officials, business owners, even a few people in the press. They're all involved in some kind of scheme, and it goes deep. Carter was close to uncovering something. Maybe too close. A chill crept up Hayes' spine. So you think they killed him because he was getting too close to the truth? Vasquez's eyes flickered with something darker. I don't just think it. I know it. Hayes wasn't sure if he could trust her. Vasquez had always been hard to read, her motivations unclear, her loyalties shifting like sand. But in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. She knew more than she was letting on. Why help me then? Hayes asked, keeping his voice low. What's in it for you? She met his gaze with a steady look, her eyes hard like steel. Because I want the same thing you do. I want to see this all come crashing down. But you don't understand what you're up against, Hayes. These people have eyes everywhere. If you go after Collins without knowing the whole picture, you won't make it out. Hayes stared at her for a long moment, considering the weight of her words. He could feel the pull of the case, the need to bring everything into the light. But she was right. He couldn't do it alone. He needed allies, even if they weren't the most trustworthy. So, what's your plan? Hayes asked. Vasquez's lips twitched into a faint smile. I've been working my way through the department's black market. If you want to take down Collins and the others, you're going to need dirt, real dirt, the kind that's untraceable. I have some of it, but it's not enough. We need more, and I know where to find it. Hayes felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was fleeting. There was something about Vasquez's tone, something about the way she was offering help that made him wary. Was she in it for herself, or was this just another game? I don't trust you, Vasquez, Hayes said, his voice low. She didn't flinch. You don't have to trust me, but you need me. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in the distance, the sound of car engines revving reached their ears. Hayes' eyes snapped back toward the group by the warehouse. They're moving, Hayes muttered, turning to Vasquez. We don't have much time. Without another word, they slipped back into the shadows, preparing to follow the group. Hayes wasn't sure where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He was in this deeper than he had ever been before. And no matter how many enemies he made, he wouldn't stop until he brought the whole damn system crashing down. Chapter 5, Blood on the Line. The city felt different that night, colder, heavier. Hayes walked alongside Vasquez, both of them keeping to the alleyways, hugging the shadows like ghosts. The storm from earlier had passed, but the humidity lingered in the air, mixing with the pungent smell of decay that seemed to permeate the streets. He kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his heart pounding with the knowledge that someone, possibly everyone, was out to get him. And yet, despite the pressure, he couldn't back down now. There was a moment of tension, a brief silence, before Vasquez broke it. You're not just doing this for Carter, are you? She asked, her voice low and sharp, like a blade cutting through the darkness. Hayes didn't immediately answer. He hadn't even fully admitted to himself that he was doing this for Carter. It was more than that now. It had become personal. I didn't sign up for this, Hayes muttered, but there's something about what he was onto. I can't just let it go. Vasquez gave a half nod. I get it. And trust me, it's bigger than you think. This isn't just about getting revenge or righting some wrong. It's a web, Hayes. And once you're in, there's no getting out. Hayes felt the weight of her words. He'd been in deeper situations before, cases that had taken years off his life, cases that had left scars that wouldn't fade. But this was different. He wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. He was fighting for survival. They made their way down a long stretch of street, and Hayes kept a wary eye on the rear. He could feel it in his bones. Someone was following them. It wasn't the faint sound of tires on wet asphalt or the distant echoes of city noise. It was the feeling that someone was breathing down his neck, just out of sight. They reached a small, unmarked door tucked between two abandoned storefronts. Vasquez glanced over at Hayes, her eyes unreadable in the dim light. This is it, she said, motioning for him to go first. This is where the real game starts. Hayes hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. It felt like stepping into the lion's den, and for the first time since this all began, he questioned his choices. But there was no going back now. No matter how deep the hole was, he'd already jumped in. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell that led underground. A pungent, metallic smell wafted up from below. Blood, sweat, and betrayal. It hit Hayes like a punch to the gut. He pushed the door open wider, motioning for Vasquez to follow. The basement beneath the building was far more expansive than Hayes had anticipated. Low-hanging lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift with every breath. The concrete floors were stained with something darker than oil, and in the far corner there were rows of rusted metal filing cabinets, each locked and bolted with chains that made an ominous clink whenever the wind swept through. This is where they keep their secrets, Vasquez whispered. All the dirty laundry that never sees the light of day. Hayes' stomach churned. What do you think Carter was looking for? Vasquez stepped toward one of the cabinets, her fingers brushing against the lock. We'll know soon enough. But be prepared, Hayes. Whatever's in here is going to change everything. She pulled out a set of keys from her jacket and moved to the cabinet. The clicking sound as she unlocked it echoed through the room, amplifying the tension in Hayes' chest. It felt like they were about to crack open Pandora's box, and Hayes wasn't sure he was ready for what they'd find inside. With a final twist of the key, the door to the cabinet swung open. Inside, there were files, dozens of them, all labeled with code names, dates, and titles that Hayes couldn't decipher. But there was one file at the front, its edges frayed, its label marked in black ink, Operation Blackout. Vasquez pulled the file free with a practiced hand, her eyes scanning the contents. Hayes could see the tension in her posture, her shoulders rigid as she flipped through the pages. The further she went, the paler she became. This is bad, Hayes. This is really bad. Hayes stepped closer, peering over her shoulder at the document she was reading. The words jumped off the pages, forming a narrative so twisted and dark that it almost felt unreal. The Blackout Initiative, a covert operation involving high-ranking police officers, politicians, and business moguls. Its purpose? To manipulate citywide events, control crime rates, and orchestrate the disappearance of anyone who threatened the balance. But that was just the surface. The deeper Hayes dug into the file, the more horrifying it became. They weren't just controlling crime. They were staging it, creating false narratives, using the law itself to conceal their true motives. And Carter? He wasn't just another casualty in their scheme. He was targeted because he was on the verge of exposing Operation Blackout to the world. He had uncovered something no one was meant to see. Vasquez slammed the file shut with trembling hands. They killed him because he got too close. He knew too much. How deep does this go? Hayes asked, his voice a low rasp. Vasquez looked up at him, her face hard. To the highest levels. This goes all the way to the mayor's office and beyond. We're not just dealing with corrupt cops, Hayes. We're dealing with an empire. Hayes felt the room closing in on him. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating him with the enormity of what they had just uncovered. How do we bring this down? Vasquez took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the file tightly. We go to the press. We expose everything. But we can't do it alone. Hayes' mind raced. He knew it wouldn't be that easy. Whoever was behind this, whoever had orchestrated the Blackout Initiative, would never let it go without a fight. This wasn't just a few dirty cops they had to take down. This was an entire system built on lies, blood, and corruption. And if they come after us? Hayes asked, his voice barely a whisper. Vasquez didn't look at him. Then we fight back. They had a plan, or at least a sliver of one. But Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking right into the lion's den. They had uncovered a dark truth, one that could ruin everything. But now that they had it, there was no turning back. As the sound of sirens echoed faintly in the distance, Hayes knew the worst was yet to come. Chapter 6: Echoes of the Past. The air was thick with tension as Hayes and Vasquez made their way out of the underground hideout, each step heavy with the weight of their discovery. The storm had passed, but the feeling of being pursued was ever present, a shadow that followed them through the alleyways and deserted streets. Hayes felt the familiar pull of fear, but now it was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about exposing a truth that could tear the city apart. The file in Vasquez's hand felt like a ticking time bomb. The information within it was more than just evidence. It was the key to unraveling the entire operation. Hayes knew they couldn't wait much longer. Every second they spent in the open was a second closer to being caught, a second closer to their enemies closing in. As they reached the car, Hayes glanced over his shoulder, paranoia gnawing at him. His instincts screamed that they were being watched, but the street was empty. He pushed the thought aside. There would be time to worry about that later. We need to get to the press, Vasquez said, her voice cold, detached. If we go public with this, they won't be able to bury it. Hayes nodded, but doubt lingered in his mind. The file was damning, but exposing it would make them targets. Powerful people were involved in this, people who had the resources to erase anyone standing in their way. He thought about Carter again, and the price he paid for trying to take down the system. Carter had been the first, but Hayes was beginning to realize he wouldn't be the last. We need to find someone we can trust, Hayes muttered. Someone who isn't on their payroll. Vasquez hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she thought. There's a reporter I know. She's good. She's been digging into city politics for years, and she's got a nose for corruption. But it's risky. She's not exactly untouchable. You think she'll help us? Hayes asked. I don't know, but she's our best shot. They drove through the city in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. Hayes kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, his fingers gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. It was clear now that everything had changed. The life he'd known, straightforward, routine, was gone. In its place, there was only this war, a battle against a corrupt system that had infiltrated every corner of the city. Vasquez spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. Hayes, we need to be ready. If we expose this, there's no going back. It'll be all-out war. I'm ready, he replied, but his words felt hollow. Was he really ready to throw everything away for the truth? Was anyone ever truly ready for the chaos that would follow? The answer was elusive, buried somewhere deep inside him. He wasn't sure, but he couldn't stop now. Too many people had been hurt, too many lives shattered, and Carter's death hung like a shadow over everything. If he didn't keep moving forward, if he didn't keep fighting, then Carter's death would have been for nothing. They arrived at a small apartment building in the heart of the city, tucked between two larger skyscrapers. The building was old, its brick facade crumbling with age. Hayes parked the car on the alley behind it, making sure no one could see them from the street. They sat for a moment, both of them silent, staring out of the car's windows. I don't like this, Vasquez finally said, her voice tight with uncertainty. We're walking into a hornet's nest. If anyone knows we're here. I know, Hayes interrupted. We just have to hope she hasn't already been compromised. The door to the apartment was simple, with no sign of the name of the tenant. It was the kind of place that would blend in perfectly, unnoticed by anyone looking to avoid attention. Hayes knocked twice, then waited, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it, the point of no return. Either they'd get the help they needed, or they'd walk into a trap. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 30s. She had sharp features, her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun, her eyes a piercing green that seemed to assess Hayes and Vasquez in an instant. She was dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, but there was something about her posture, tense, alert, that told Hayes she wasn't an ordinary reporter. She was used to danger, used to walking through fire. Vasquez, the woman said, her voice low but steady. You should have called before showing up like this. I didn't have a choice, Alexis, Vasquez replied, her tone matching the reporter's. We need your help. Now. Alexis stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Hayes followed Vasquez into the small apartment, which was cluttered with stacks of papers, old coffee cups, and notebooks filled with scribbled notes. It was clear that Alexis had been working tirelessly, chasing the same stories that had brought them all together. What's this about? Alexis asked, crossing her arms. You look like you've been through hell. Vasquez wasted no time. We have information about a citywide conspiracy, corruption at the highest levels, involving cops, politicians, and business moguls. It's all tied to a covert operation called Blackout. Alexis raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. And you expect me to believe this? I don't expect you to believe anything, Vasquez replied. I just need you to take a look at this. She pulled the file from her bag and laid it on the table in front of Alexis. The reporter's eyes flicked over the documents, her brow furrowing as she read the names and the details. The more she read, the more her expression hardened. This is big, Alexis said quietly. Too big. If this is real. It's real, Hayes interjected. We're going to take this public, but we need you to help us do it. We need to make sure the right people see this. Alexis nodded slowly, still processing the magnitude of what they were asking. I'll help you, she said finally. But you're going to need more than just my word. You need hard proof, something that can't be ignored. I know, Vasquez said. We'll find it. But we need to move fast. They're already on to us. Then let's get to work, Alexis said, her tone now sharp, decisive. We don't have time to waste. As Hayes and Vasquez exchanged a glance, the weight of their mission settled upon them like a shroud. They had no way of knowing how deep the conspiracy went or how many enemies they were about to make, but there was no turning back. The fight was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than they could have imagined. But as Hayes looked at the files in front of them, he felt something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. the kind of hope that came from knowing they were on the right side of the fight. And maybe, just maybe, they could bring the truth to light before it was buried forever. Chapter 7: The Shifting Sands. The hours bled into each other as Hayes sat in Alexis's cramped apartment, the walls around him closing in. The buzz of the city outside seemed muffled, like the world had paused, waiting for something to happen. He felt the weight of every decision hanging over him, each one carrying the potential to destroy everything he'd worked for, or worse, in his life. Vasquez was across from him, scanning through the files they brought with him. She didn't look up, but Hayes knew what she was thinking. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. They were in deep, deeper than they'd ever expected. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed like the walls were closing in on them. Alexis had been quiet for the past hour, her sharp eyes flicking between them as she meticulously went through the documents, cross-referencing names and numbers with her own research. Hayes could see the weight in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed the desk in a rhythm that spoke of impatience. Finally, she broke the silence. "There's something here I didn't expect," she said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on a specific file. "I've been tracking a string of high-profile disappearances for months. People close to city officials, journalists, activists, lawyers. It wasn't until now that I realized they're all connected." Hayes's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, eager for more. "What do you mean?" "These disappearances, they're not random," Alexis explained, her voice calm but heavy with gravity. "It's a pattern, and it's pointing directly at the people in power. This blackout operation, it's not just some covert mission. It's the cover for something much bigger. It's the reason people are vanishing." Hayes's pulse quickened. "You think it's connected to the corruption we found?" "I know it is," Alexis said firmly. "But there's more. Someone inside the department, someone high up, is orchestrating these disappearances. I've been digging into the records, and I think I've found a link." Vasquez looked up, eyes narrowing. "A link?" "I can't say for sure yet," Alexis admitted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "But I'm close. Too close. Whoever's behind this is protecting their own, and they're cleaning up their tracks faster than I can keep up." The air in the room seemed to thicken as Hayes absorbed the weight of her words. He'd known that they were dealing with powerful enemies, but this was worse than he'd imagined. They weren't just uncovering a conspiracy, they were stumbling into a full-blown criminal syndicate that had its claws in every part of the city, every institution that should have been keeping people safe. Vasquez slammed her fist on the table. "Damn it. We need to move faster. We don't have the luxury of playing catch-up." Hayes stood up, pacing the room. "We need to find out who's behind this, whoever's pulling the strings. And we need to do it before they silence us, too." "Silence?" Alexis echoed, looking up sharply. "They've already started. The disappearances? They're not just cleaning up loose ends. They're making examples of people. You won't be safe for long if you keep pushing this. Neither will I." Hay stopped, meeting Alexis's gaze. "You think I don't know that? I'm not afraid of them." "I know you're not," Alexis said quietly. "But being brave doesn't make you invincible." There was a heavy silence as the words settled between them, thick with truth. Hayes knew the stakes. He had already lost everything: his badge, his reputation, his sense of right and wrong. But he hadn't lost his will to fight, and he wasn't about to back down now, not when they were so close to the truth. "We have to hit them hard," Vasquez said, breaking the silence. "Take them by surprise. Catch them off guard before they can bury us." "Agreed," Hayes said. "But we need to be smart about this. We can't just charge in without a plan. We need proof, something concrete that no one can deny." I'll keep digging, Alexis said. But be careful. The deeper you go, the more dangerous it gets. You'll be marked as targets. There's no way around that. They left Alexis's apartment well after midnight, the city streets empty and silent. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air lingered, thick and oppressive. Hayes kept his eyes on the road, his mind racing. The pieces were falling into place, but there was still one critical piece they were missing, the one that would tie it all together. Whoever was behind this, whoever was orchestrating the disappearances and pulling the strings in the department, had to be exposed. Vasquez sat beside him, her silence a testament to her own thoughts. Hayes knew she was as determined as he was to bring this to an end, but he also knew she was more realistic. She had been a part of the system for long enough to know just how far corruption could go, how deep it ran. She understood the risks, but she also knew that the fight they were up against was bigger than anything they had faced before. Where to now? She asked, her voice breaking the silence. We need to go through the records again, Hayes replied, his gaze focused on the road ahead. The missing persons files. There has to be something we missed. Someone we can trace. And after that? After that, we go after the man in charge, Hayes said, his voice low and steady. We expose him for what he is. And if we don't make it out alive, at least we'll know we did the right thing. Vasquez nodded, her jaw set in determination. Let's get it done. They drove in silence for a while longer, the city lights flickering in the distance like beacons guiding them to an uncertain future. Hayes knew they were close, but he also knew the danger they were in. There were too many enemies, too many people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. But Hayes wasn't about to back down. Not now, not when the truth was within reach. As they pulled up to the precinct, Hayes's stomach churned. The walls that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison, the very place where his world had been shattered. He had to keep going, keep pushing forward. There was no turning back. He grabbed the file from the back seat, the evidence still fresh in his hands. This was it, the moment that would define everything. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, but there was no other choice. He was in this for good, and the game was about to get a whole lot more dangerous. Chapter 8, The Final Hour. The darkness of the precinct seemed to stretch endlessly as Hayes and Vasquez moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Hayes's mind was a blur of information, threads of the investigation weaving together in an intricate web that he was now too deep in to back out of. Every door they passed felt like a potential trap, every shadow hiding a potential enemy. The precinct, once a place where justice was served, now seemed like the belly of a beast, its walls closing in with each passing moment. Do you feel that? Vasquez's voice was barely a whisper as they rounded a corner, her gaze darting nervously around them. Hayes didn't need to ask what she meant. He could feel it too, the sense of being watched, the prickling awareness that they were not alone. The walls were closing in, and it wasn't just the investigation that was getting tighter. Someone knew they were coming. Someone knew they were getting too close. We can't stop now, Hayes said, his voice low but firm. We've got the proof. We just need to get it to the right people. Right people? Vasquez scoffs, the tension in her voice palpable. Who the hell are the right people anymore? Everyone's either corrupt or too scared to do anything about it. Hayes glanced at her, his face hard. He could feel the truth of her words. He had spent years in this system, and he'd seen firsthand how the higher-ups protected their own, no matter the cost. But this was different. They had the evidence, hard, undeniable evidence, and Hayes wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers now. There's always someone, he said, his voice more to himself than to her. There's always someone who'll fight for what's right. Vasquez didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. Hayes could see the doubt in her eyes, the weariness that came from years of battling a system that seemed to be built on lies and deceit. But he couldn't afford to let that doubt creep into his own mind. Not now. Not when they were so close. They reached the back offices, the area where the precinct's highest-ranking officers kept their files, their records. It was locked, but Hayes had been here enough times to know the combination by heart. He punched in the numbers, and the door clicked open with a soft sigh. Inside, rows upon rows of filing cabinets stretched out before them, filled with everything from criminal records to confidential case files. "We need to get to the blackout operation files," Hayes muttered, moving quickly toward the far side of the room. He didn't bother to glance back at Vasquez. He knew she'd follow him. They were past the point of hesitation now. As he rifled through the drawers, his heart raced. Every second they spent here increased the risk of being caught, but the payoff was worth it. The documents they needed were there. The names of the officers involved, the dates of key meetings, and most importantly, the final link, the one person who had been pulling the strings all along. And that person was someone Hayes had once trusted. His breath caught in his throat as he found it, the file with the name he had dreaded seeing. Captain Elias Granger, the man who had once been his mentor, the man who had taught him everything he knew about law enforcement, the man who had helped Hayes rise through the ranks. Hayes stood frozen for a moment, staring at the file. His mind spun with disbelief. Granger had been behind all of this? It didn't make sense. The captain had always seemed like a man of honor, a man who followed the law no matter the cost. But the evidence was right there in black and white. "He's the one," Hayes muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. Vasquez stepped up behind him, looking over his shoulder at the file. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice low and filled with a mix of anger and shock. Granger? The bastard who led the charge against the city's biggest criminals? The one who was supposed to clean up this place? "Apparently, he was the biggest criminal of them all," Hayes said, his voice hollow. "I don't know how or when it happened, but Granger became the puppet master. And we've been following his strings this entire time." "We need to get this to the press," Vasquez said quickly, her tone sharp. "We can't sit on this. If we want to bring down everyone involved, we need to expose him, and fast." Hayes shook his head. "It's not that simple. Granger's too connected. If we go public, it's over. The media will eat this up, but they won't stop him. He'll bury it before it even gets out of the precinct." "So what do you suggest?" Vasquez asked, her voice low and taut with frustration. "Sit on it and pray for a miracle?" "No," Hayes said, his voice cold. "We're going to take him down ourselves." The decision had been made. There was no going back now. Hayes and Vasquez didn't waste another moment. They grabbed the file and made their way out of the office, but as they reached the hallway, a sudden sound froze them both. The door at the far end of the corridor creaked open. Hayes's heart pounded in his chest as he and Vasquez ducked into a small utility closet, holding their breath as they listened. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, too deliberate. "They know we're here," Hayes whispered, his hand gripping the file tightly. Vasquez's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape route. "We need to move now." They didn't wait to be caught. They bolted through the back halls, their footsteps a blur as they made their way toward the parking garage. The building was alive with the hum of activity, but all Hayes could think about was getting out. They couldn't afford to be caught now, not when they were so close. They reached the exit and burst into the night air, their lungs filling with the cool breeze. The city seemed quieter now, the streets emptier, as though everyone had vanished into the shadows. The car was parked just a few feet away, but Hayes's heart raced as he scanned the parking lot. He could feel it now. The hunt was on. Whoever had been watching them knew where they were, and they wouldn't stop until they had everything. "Get in the car," Hayes said, urgency in his voice. "We're not safe here." As they piled into the vehicle, Hayes glanced at the file one last time. It wasn't over. Not yet. But they had one shot left. Granger was about to make his move, and they needed to stay one step ahead. "Next up," Hayes said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel, "we bring the fight to him." Chapter 9. The Last Stand. The weight of the file in Hayes's hand seemed heavier than ever as he sped through the city streets. The neon lights blurred in the rear-view mirror, reflecting his growing sense of urgency. Every turn, every stoplight felt like a potential trap, a chance for someone to catch up with them, to silence them before they could expose the truth. He had one objective now: stop Captain Granger before it was too late. The file held everything Hayes needed to bring Granger down. His connections to criminal cartels, the illegal arms deals, the dirty money funneled through city contracts. Granger had played the system for years, hiding behind a badge, and now he was pulling strings that reached into every dark corner of the city. But it was more than that. There were names, too. The officers, the corrupt businessmen, even city officials who had been in Granger's pocket for years. This was bigger than Hayes had ever imagined, and now it was his responsibility to take it down. "Where to?" Vasquez asked, her voice calm but tinged with anxiety. She was trying to steady herself, but Hayes could see the tension in her eyes. She had known the stakes from the beginning, but now that they were closer to the endgame, the weight of the situation was hitting her harder than ever. "The only place we can go," Hayes replied, eyes fixed ahead. "We need to get this to internal affairs." Vasquez looked at him skeptically. "Internal affairs? After everything Granger's done? You really think they're going to take us seriously?" Hayes didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure, but the evidence was undeniable. They could run to the press, but Granger's connections would bury the story before it ever saw the light of day. The only people who could take action were the ones still loyal to the force. Hayes had to believe that somewhere there were good cops who hadn't sold their souls. "They have to," Hayes muttered under his breath, the words more to himself than to her. "They have to." By the time they reached the edge of the city, the traffic had slowed to a crawl, the streets filled with late-night drivers and pedestrian shadows. The chill of the night air pressed in against the car, but Hayes barely noticed. His focus was on the next move. They were closing in on Internal Affairs headquarters, a gray building that stood like a monument to the force's dwindling honor. Inside, rumors whispered of corrupt officers and dirty deals, but Hayes was counting on the few who still believed in justice. He had no other choice. As they pulled into the parking lot, Hayes felt a pang of doubt. What if this was another trap? What if Granger had already infiltrated IA and was waiting for them? He pushed the thought aside. If they didn't do this now, they might never have another chance. The car screeched to a halt in the nearest parking space, and they both stepped out, moving swiftly toward the entrance. The building was eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Hayes's heart beat faster as he scanned the lobby, searching for any sign of danger. He didn't know how much time they had, but he knew it wasn't long. They made their way to the elevator, Vasquez's hand hovering near her sidearm. Hayes glanced at her, silently urging her to stay calm. The worst thing they could do now was panic. "Ready?" Hayes asked, his voice tight with the weight of their mission. Vasquez nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Let's finish this." The elevator doors slid open with a soft ding, and they stepped inside. Hayes pushed the button for the third floor, where Internal Affairs was located. As the elevator rose, the silence between them was suffocating. The air felt thick with the tension of what was to come. If Granger had his people in IA, this could very well be their last stand. The elevator jolted to a stop, and Hayes's gut twisted. The doors slid open. They weren't alone. A group of officers stood at the far end of the hallway, their faces unreadable, their postures rigid. Hayes's instincts kicked in immediately. They weren't here by coincidence. These weren't just cops. They were Granger's men. "You're making a mistake, Hayes," one of them said, stepping forward. It was Officer McKinney, a tall man with a hard face. Hayes had crossed paths with him a few times in the past, but he hadn't known the man well. It didn't matter now. McKinney was one of them, one of the men on Granger's payroll. "You're the ones who are making the mistake," Hayes said, his voice calm but filled with lethal intent. He could feel the weight of the file in his jacket, and he knew the stakes. If you didn't get this to the right people, it would all be for nothing. McKinney chuckled darkly, his hand inching toward his sidearm. "You really think internal affairs is going to side with you? After everything you've done? You're nothing but a washed-up cop, Hayes. You and your little partner are about to become the next two bodies they sweep under the rug." Vasquez tensed beside him, but Hayes raised a hand to stop her. He wasn't ready to fight yet, not until he knew they were out of options. "What do you want?" Hayes asked, his voice measured. "We want the file," McKinney replied. "Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you walk away." "Maybe." Hayes shook his head. "You'll never get your hands on it. It's already too late." McKinney's eyes hardened. "Then you leave us no choice." With a sharp gesture, McKinney's men moved in, their hands quickly reaching for their weapons. Hayes's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. He'd been in worse situations. He'd survived worse. But this was different. This time, he had something to fight for, something worth more than his own life. "Get ready," Hayes said to Vasquez, his voice low. The standoff was broken by a distant sound, the unmistakable roar of a helicopter growing louder. McKinney's eyes darted toward the window, and for just a moment, his attention wavered. That was all the time Hayes needed. Without thinking, he bolted toward McKinney, his fist connecting with the officer's jaw in a single, brutal strike. The force sent McKinney stumbling back, knocking several others off balance. "Move!" Hayes shouted to Vasquez. Together, they rushed for the back door, their feet pounding the floor as they sprinted down the narrow hallway. They could hear the officers behind them, but Hayes had a plan. He had to make it to the rooftop. The helicopter, the one he had heard earlier, was their only way out. The door to the rooftop was just ahead. Hayes's breath came in ragged gasps, his muscles burning as they pushed forward. They were so close now. One last push. Chapter 10, The Truth Exposed. The rooftop was bathed in a haunting orange glow as the helicopter's blades cut through the night air. Hayes's chest heaved as he and Vasquez scrambled up the stairs, each step echoing through the silence of the building. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing louder. The men McKinney had sent after them were relentless, but Hayes had no intention of going down without a fight. He had made it this far. He wasn't about to be stopped now. The rooftop door slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud. Hayes's eyes darted around. The helicopter was already hovering just above the building, its powerful engines thrumming. It was their escape, their last chance to get the truth out of the city before Granger's men could silence them forever. "Get on," Hayes shouted to Vasquez as the helicopter's side door swung open. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon, but then she nodded. She didn't need to ask what would happen if they didn't make it out. The alternative was too grand to consider. Together, they rushed toward the helicopter, the wind from the rotors pressing against them. The pilot, a familiar face, gave a quick nod and jerked his thumb toward the door. "Let's go," the pilot shouted over the noise. As they scrambled inside, Hayes caught a glimpse of McKinney's men rounding the corner of the building. They were too late. The helicopter lifted off just as the first of them reached the rooftop, their furious shouts lost in the noise of the blades. They were finally free. The city below them shrank into a maze of lights, the streets, an endless sea of shadows. Hayes leaned back in the seat, feeling the tension in his muscles begin to ease. But his mind was still racing. The file was secure, but what about Granger? What about all the officers, all the people who had been complicit in this nightmare? Vasquez sat across from him, her face pale but determined. She held her composure, but Hayes knew she was processing everything that had just happened, the betrayal, the escape, and the lives now hanging in the balance. "You think it's over?" Vasquez asked, her voice steady despite the chaos that had unfolded. "No," Hayes replied, his gaze fixed on the distant skyline. "Granger will come after us. He's not going to stop just because we've got the evidence. But now we have something to fight with. We have the truth." Vasquez leaned back, taking in the weight of his words. "And that's enough?" "More than enough." Hayes's eyes narrowed, a fire reigniting within him. "This city doesn't belong to Granger and his crew. It belongs to the people. And we're going to make sure they know what he's done. We're going to make sure they know what he's done. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth." Hours later, they touched down at a small airstrip on the outskirts of the city. Hayes stepped off the helicopter, feeling the cold night air against his skin. It was a moment of calm after the storm, but it was only temporary. The real fight was just beginning. The file had been delivered to Internal Affairs, but there were still things that needed to be done. Hayes had already made plans to meet with reporters to ensure that the story got out to the public. Granger could hide behind his badge for only so long. Once the media got their hands on the evidence, everything would change. The pilot offered them a quick nod before stepping back into the helicopter and preparing to leave. Hayes glanced at Vasquez. "I'll call you when it's time," Hayes said, his voice low but resolute. "We've done our part. Now it's in the hands of the people." Vasquez nodded. "I'll be ready." As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the horizon, Hayes stood alone on the airstrip, staring at the city that had been his home for so long. But now it felt different. It felt like a city on the edge of something huge, something that could either tear it apart or rebuild it from the ground up. 5 days later, the front page of every major news outlet carried the story, "Corrupt Cop Syndicate Exposed. City's police force under investigation." The headlines were a blur of shock and outrage, but Hayes had expected nothing less. Granger's name was mentioned in every article, along with a list of officers, politicians, and businessmen who had been complicit in the web of corruption. Internal Affairs had moved quickly, arresting several key figures, including Granger, who had been taken into custody without a fight. His world was unraveling, piece by piece. But Hayes knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The corrupt system that had thrived for years couldn't be undone overnight, but at least the truth had been revealed. As he sat in his apartment, the file now locked away in a safe place, Hayes allowed himself a moment to breathe. The phone rang. He picked it up without looking at the caller ID. "You did it," Vasquez's voice came through the line, her tone light but filled with respect. "We did it." Hayes exhaled, his gaze drifting to the skyline in the distance. For the first time in years, he felt like he had finally done something right. He'd exposed the truth, brought down the people who had abused their power, and, most importantly, he had redeemed himself. "It's not over," Hayes replied, his voice steady. "But we made a dent, and that's a start." In the distance, the city glimmered beneath the fading night sky, the lights of 1,000 stories waiting to be told. Hayes knew the battle was far from finished, but for the first time, he felt like he could stand tall again. The truth had been exposed. and nothing could silence it now.